Hello everyone, I'm back again to yap more about the designs of a Devil May Cry game for an hour or so. This time we're going to be talking about the oft-maligned reboot DmC Devil May Cry, which has themes and ideas that I criticised quite heavily in my main review of it, and while I do stick largely by a lot of the points that I made in that original review, it is still worth taking a little bit more of a look under the microscope to see what the game is actually doing, and where it has some interesting ideas, and where those ideas start to fall down, as there are definitely more than a few diamond-in-the-rough designs here and there. Additionally, I'd just like to thank everyone who watched my original DMC video. It performed so much better than I ever could have dreamed, and I got a load of interesting comments, some of which I'm going to expand on in this video, because some people made some very interesting points that I would normally respond to in text, but I find it a bit restricting to try and respond to these kind of things in text form, and I feel like I give my best responses in sort of like voice video type thing. Anyway, let's get on with analysing the designs of DMC Devil May Cry. DMC has a couple of kind of main major ideas to mention. Firstly, it takes some bits of inspiration from what the original series was doing. There's this continuous idea of demons projecting this front of absolute power but actually being quite weak. There's the idea of humans versus demons, or there being this kind of strong moral binary, but in this game it's more like demons versus angels. Also, like the base series, this game analyzes themes of rebellion and the purpose of rebellion, but does it through a different lens. It's much more societal, looking at rebellion through ideas of rebelling against corrupt authority and how those corrupt authorities use systems that are meant to help and support people in order to cause harm. There's a large dabbling of modern Western pop culture as well, with references like Bill O'Reilly, Jeff Bezos, all kinds of Western public figures that have been sprinkled in for the game to criticize. And despite this political and societal commentary being there though, there's very little kind of done with it. It's just sort of, yeah, this person bad, without much like actual interesting thematic expansion on it. For example, in Devil May Cry 3, when it was analysing themes of religion, and how religious iconography could very easily be perverted to do evil, Arkham is a pretty in-depth and well-realized character for expressing that theme. He reveres demons with this religious zeal, and believes that all of humanity is fundamentally born in sin, and that therefore we need a closer connection with the demons to truly understand ourselves and to gain greater power. It also kind of tries to go for the not all demons are evil, like moral grey angle, but it doesn't really do it well because it doesn't take the time necessary to focus on it. There are aspects of this kind of moral grey running through the game, but they're never really in-depth or challenging. You've got kind of Phineas challenging the idea that not all demons are bad, and the plot point with Mundus' son, but neither of these kind of go anywhere. Similarly, you've got Vergil acting as an ends justify the means character, meanwhile Dante believes that no loss of human life is worth it, but none of these concepts really get strong enough examination, largely because the game is trying to do a lot with very little. Now, I'm actually going to take a little bit of a sidetrack here to discuss an interesting point that was brought up in one of my comments. A commenter by the name of Voidstrider Lucatiel posited the idea that I'm actually mistaken about the base roots of Devil May Cry, and that it is actually firmly rooted in Eastern spiritual tradition. Even though it is taking a lot of Western ideas, it's reinterpreting those through the idea of Eastern spiritual traditions and doing something completely different with them. And that therefore, I was misunderstanding a lot of the base thematic ideas of the DMC reboot, because the DMC reboot was actually being really clever and inverting that and examining the base ideas of the DMC series through a much more Western lens. Now, this is a really interesting comment, and it got me to look at DMC from a very interesting angle that I hadn't looked at it from before. This kind of spiritual, theological basis behind the themes of it. You know, how has the mythology behind DMC inspired its themes and its messages? As I said, this is a very interesting perspective that I hadn't looked at DMC from. And despite the very unnecessary condescending tone of the comment, it was very interesting. So I actually did some thinking about this, and some research into it. So let's start by talking about the base DMC series before we move on to the spiritual ideas presented through the reboot. Let's establish a base before we talk about how the reboot inverted it. Well, it is kind of very obvious that Western theology is a gigantic inspiration for Devil May Cry. It is, after all, originally based on the Divine Comedy, the story of Dante and Vergil's journey through hell. And although it doesn't take very many structural points from that story, it does take a lot of thematic elements and ideas about how demons function within the world. In Western theology, there are kind of two main, universally agreed upon origins for why Satan and the demons fell. First off, the Christian idea is that Satan was just so immensely powerful at the point of his birth that this spurred this kind of constant sense of pride within him, and he genuinely believed he was better than God, which is why he tried to revolt, and was then cast down. Now, this tremendous sense of pride can be seen in the demons of base DMC, as they believe themselves to be fundamentally the most powerful beings in the universe, and they deserve to rule over the earth in place of humans, and that humans are nothing more than their food source. You can see this beautifully through Mundus in DMC 1. Furthermore, you have the second main agreed upon origin for Satan's fall, which comes partially from Islamic tradition and was then reinforced through Milton's poem Paradise Lost, where Satan is said to have refused to bow down to humanity when God commanded it, stating that "you made me from fire and them from clay," clearly communicating this sort of perceived difference that Satan had divine power and that therefore humans were just beings of mud below him. Again, as I said before, this relates pretty much one-to-one with how the demons in DMC act. Of course, because this is a very action-oriented piece of media, the idea of divine power here is less about sort of divine power of lore and creation, and more about your ability to shoot magical laser beams. But regardless, the idea is still very much there. So, does base DMC incorporate any aspects from Shinto, as Voidstrider Lucatiel posits? Sort of. It's arguable. I don't think this person goes about arguing this case the best, and the way that it comes off, although I'm sure that it's not intentional, is very much kind of saying that Japanese people can only view Western stories through the lens of Eastern tradition. And that's just kinda not a very good thing to say. But regardless, as unintentional as I'm sure that is, I don't believe this person makes a single solid point as to where the Eastern inspiration for Devil May Cry comes in. They sort of mention aspects about how this duality between the sacred and the profane wouldn't have worked if Dante was half angel, half human in the base series. But the point isn't about being half sacred and half profane. It's about the idea of power versus powerlessness, heart versus heartlessness. And the duality between absolute power and the absolute compassion to wield that power properly, and how, at least in the first game, demons are presented as absolutely strong but with no heart to wield their strength, and humans are presented as completely weak but with the heart to use strength properly if it was given to them. And that's why demons always underestimate humans and how humans can become stronger than demons. Now, the point where the Eastern influence is kind of arguable is where we start to see demons taking on more positive traits, like with Griffin, for example, where a demon fundamentally isn't inherently evil. Many of them are shown to have this sort of counterbalance of honorable aspects. Griffin is a really good example of this, with how his character actually develops further down the series into DMC 5. This relates to Shintoism and Eastern tradition because in Shintoism, the supernatural is kind of this amorphous blob of things that are not human, going by different definitions. At base, you have a yokai. If a yokai becomes hated enough, it becomes a demon. If a yokai is worshipped enough, it becomes a kami or god. That is not an entirely accurate description, but it's just simpler to give that definition for the video, considering how complex Japanese spirituality is. Now, looking at it from that framework, now you could definitely argue that the idea that demons can sort of change their nature and become good based on their choices does sort of relate to these aspects of Shinto theology, and I wouldn't necessarily say it's strong enough to justify this whole Eastern influence on base Devil May Cry point. But, going over to the flip side, how does DmC Devil May Cry present its demons? Well, in DmC Devil May Cry, demons appear to be much more of a sort of natural, living part of the world. There are far fewer demons that exhibit direct sentience, and when they do appear, their true form seems to be this black ooze that seeps out of the gaps found within Limbo. And that black ooze then accumulates bits of random scrap found throughout the human world and forms humanoid bodies. This isn't consistent across all of the designs in the game, but for the most part, it can be established that this black ooze is the true form of the demons, even though it isn't directly stated. Now, this idea of, like, a demon possessing regular objects and using them to attack people or cause mischief reminds me actually a lot more strongly of yokai within Japanese tradition. And though I wouldn't say the way that demons work in the DMC reboot is entirely based off that, it does seem to take a lot more elements actually from Eastern ideas. You have a lot more demons that are the demon of something functionally. For example, Barbas is the demon of information. Succubus can be implied to be the demon of addiction. And you have demons personifying far more abstract ideas than you do in something like the base series, where demons are just kind of things that appear. They aren't really truly embodiments of anything in the same way. All of that said though, I do think both the reboot and the base series base their ideas of how demons work within this world much more strongly off of Western tradition than of Eastern tradition. I don't think that there's that much play around with sort of mixing Western and Eastern aspects in either base or reboot. And that for the most part, they're actually just taking Western ideas and playing around with them in new and interesting ways. As it says in the title, Devil May Cry, the main theme of Devil May Cry is almost this sort of hopeless optimism that even a devil, something which within the Bible is presented as a force of absolute evil that never repents, can have an emotional core to it. And that's not really an idea that's within Eastern mythology either. So I think there's not a super strong basis to that idea. All of that said, I would really genuinely like to thank Lucatiel, because this sent me down a rabbit hole that was a very interesting rabbit hole, and it was a very interesting and insightful comment, so thank you. Anyway, I've kind of faffed around enough here talking about theme, so let's talk about the actual character design, shall we? I think while I definitely don't like the design of the new Dante, on just kind of a personal taste level, I'd be hard-pressed to say it isn't functional. You've got this grey jacket with a red inner lining and white shirt. Colours that all contrast very nicely off each other and represent his three key natures: human, angel, and devil. And it's actually very nicely thematically constructed. You've got the human outer layer concealing the devil on the inner lining. He's concealing this devil inside. But then your eye is immediately drawn to the white. Fundamentally, Dante is not an evil character, even though I'd say he's a pretty badly managed one. And so the design wants you to know that there is this kind of purity to him underneath everything. Younger Dante also evokes much of the same aspects as his cousin in DMC 3. He's defined by symbols of punk rock and rebellion. It's just, 2010s punk rock and rebellion, as opposed to 2000s punk rock and rebellion. Now, I've seen several comments that respond to a lot of my criticisms of Dante's character being very flat, by saying that he's supposed to be more naturalistic. He's got no sort of sense of thematic fantasy about him. And I understand this point, but I feel that all too often the idea of a character being quote-unquote naturalistic and not spoon-feeding the audience is used to defend cases of a character just not being written. Characters should have central ideas and themes that define their character, even in the most simple and brain-dead of stories. That is the fundamental construction point of a story. No matter how abstract, no matter how strange, every character is constructed to make a point. Now, Dante can consider to be more naturalistic and act like a real human, sure, but let's examine that and see if he does act very naturalistic. Dante's character arc in DMC sees him beginning the game as a debaucherous, lecherous fellow who revels in sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And through his interactions with Vergil and Cat, he becomes a much more responsible and all-round lovable guy. This mirrors the arc of Dante in Devil May Cry 3 quite closely, so let's examine the differences between those two. In Devil May Cry 3, Dante's change from being completely irresponsible to being someone who takes responsibility for Vergil and the change that he needs to make in the world is actually quite gradual, at least as gradual as it can be over the course of like a 7 to 8 hour game. He begins only caring about fighting Vergil for the sake of fighting Vergil. He doesn't care about stopping him to save the people of the city or to take responsibility for how the actions of his family are negatively impacting the world around him. He just does it because he wants to. He's a carefree asshole who just doesn't care about anything and wants to fight, essentially. A mirror of how Reboot Dante doesn't care about anything and all he wants is sex, drugs, rock and roll, and killing demons. Okay, so slowly, throughout the course of the game, as is bookmarked by his fights with Vergil, Dante's opinion of things begins to change, and he slowly, over time, takes responsibility for his role in getting rid of Vergil. He's forced at every step to confront the consequences that his apathy towards his responsibility for his brother causes. Meanwhile, Dante is not really forced to face the consequences of his earlier lecherous and debaucherous actions in the same way. In fact, he just sort of gets over it, like it was never there in the first place. And that fundamentally just doesn't feel natural. Yeah, I get the idea that the whole point was it was a coping mechanism because he couldn't find a greater purpose, but it feels like he should at least be forced to face that in some way in order to be a likable and interesting character. Instead, it feels like he just sort of floats between motivation and characterization wherever the plot needs him to be, and that just doesn't feel satisfying. He doesn't develop. He begins the game unsure of who he is and his place in the world, and ends the game unsure of who he is and his place in the world. You could argue this is something that was in place to be dealt with in the sequels, and that might be fair, but I can only go off of what this game gives you, and in the end, it kind of gives you nothing with his character in that sense. He becomes sort of concerned with humanity's well-being, but it's better clarified as he's just concerned with Kat's well-being, because she's the love interest and she must be protected. But this isn't even something that the story places great focus on. These two characters, despite their connection being central to a lot of the decisions that Dante makes later on, do not have any chemistry together whatsoever in terms of how they are written. He's just a passive observer, wheeling along wherever the plot needs him to be, making the decisions that the plot needs him to make, without being challenged truly as a character until arguably the last scene, which I will admit is pretty decent, but the build-up to justify that scene just isn't there. I think a particularly bad example of this is the final Mundus and Dante interaction, where rather than having any proper, even simple rebuke for Mundus, like reaffirming humanity's strength, he just kind of goes, "Ah, well, your son dead, lol." And that, it just doesn't feel satisfying. Yeah, original Dante would have made some sort of crack here, but it would have had an edge of seriousness to it rather than just being lol, lol, haha. I really feel that, once again, the creators of the DMC reboot just kind of fundamentally misunderstood his character. I think another really good example of that is the fact that he's a Nephilim. I complained about this before, but the idea of him just being this super special half-angel, half-demon hybrid, specially destined to take over the human world, and he's the bestest of everyone and super special, it just doesn't feel right. Like, yes, absolutely, there was an aspect of specialness about Dante because he was half human, half demon. In the base DMC's world, being half human, half demon is kind of more of a nerf than anything. Generally speaking, though, I think the designs of his new weapons are okay. They lose a lot of the silly gothic charm of things like DMC Rebellion and Nevin, but they make up for it in their own kind of angular punk, being sharp and pointy is cool, 2010s design aesthetic, where you've got Rebellion that looks like it was wrought out of like warped metal, and then you've got Arbiter, Eryx, Osiris, and Aquila. My main problem is that there's no real difference in shape language between the demonic weapons and angelic weapons. They're all just sort of very bland looking and either shrouded in fire or light respectively. Now there is an interesting difference between the actual weapons used. You've got an axe and fists, two incredibly brutal, uncompromising weapons used to represent the demons, and a pair of glaives and a scythe used to represent the angels, two more technical and graceful weapons. This is really cool, and as I mentioned in my base review, there's some cool ideas of thematics through gameplay with how the demon weapons aim to throw you down to the ground and the angel weapons aim to flick you up into the air and juggle you around. This is really cool, but I feel that there's nothing in terms of actual interesting shape or design being done with these weapons that would have elevated them a little bit higher for me. I think Reboot Dante could have been a really cool inversion if he just had a few more interesting twists. If they just committed more solidly onto the ideas that they presented here. Like, yeah, seeing a twist on DMC 3 Dante where Dante is like a lecherous, edgy punk, but then comes out of that, comes into his own, and is forced to recognize and deal with those problems. Like, if him fighting Succubus was a symbolic act of him fighting his own addiction, and he actually had to struggle through that in some way, that would be insanely cool, and it would feel more naturalistic and kind of excuse the lack of core good thematics to him. That said, as much as I said before, it might not be personally to my taste, but I can't deny this design is solidly functional. Generally speaking, that's going to be the running theme here, even in places where I might not like it. This is definitely a solid C tier for me. Cat is another example of a potentially really interesting character that the game practically refuses to do anything with. She's a modern-day witch and a spiritual medium, able to see into limbo and manipulate it using certain spells she crafts inside of things like spray paint cans and egg timers. It's this really fucking cool, like, urban witch concept, bringing the modern day into something that we always associate with being quite archaic, natural, and elemental. And I just wish that it was used more within the game, rather than having her either just be a voice in the chair or a damsel that you have to save the entire way through. There are a few missions where she actively gets to use her abilities, and funnily enough, they're some of the most interesting from a gameplay perspective. I'm especially thinking of a system something like Elizabeth in Bioshock Infinite, which would be so interesting for level design and traversal, but missed potential aside, her design is okay. It's got some cool elements like the hand tattoos, dark eyeliner, and necklaces, which contributes to her main supernatural element, which is the third eye tattooed on her forehead, in line with Dharmic traditions of intuition and spiritual clarity, which links in nicely with how she can see into the demon world.
Outside of these cool details though, most of which, barring the third eye, are really quite minor details, the rest of her design is a little plain. I think it would be more interesting if there was more to show who this person is. Like, we know she crafts spells out of what is essentially scrap, so maybe she has a belt lined with all sorts of different tools and spray paint cans. Yes, I know some pieces of art show her with one, but I wish it was bigger and more prominent, and this kind of scrappy nature defined her design a lot more, as opposed to her just bringing a hoodie and short shorts to fight the armies of hell. Now, as a character, Cat is very much fine. She's more of a function than a real person, which is sad. She reminds me a lot of Trish, being conceptually very cool, but not having all that much to kind of back it up. She serves mostly as a love interest to Dante, and the person who is supposed to unbury Dante's humanity, or more accurately, given the themes of the game, unbury Dante's angelic side, but neither of these aspects work particularly well. C tier, again, some strong base aspects, but not really used to any interesting effect. Vergil in DMC is, dare I say it, not that bad in a post-Fedora economy, at least for the base game. We'll get to what the DLC does to him later on, but for now, just discussing the base design, it keeps a lot of elements from base DMC, reinterpreted into new forms. It retains the open chest versus closed coat dynamic from the third game, as well as keeping their contrasting color schemes. Dante is a lot more bright, Vergil is a lot more dark. I think the high collar, sharp black coat and slick backed hair gives him this pretty strong angular shape language that contrasts well with Dante. Accents of blue then break up the sharp coat nicely, adding this ethereal, otherworldly edge to him that works really nicely and serves to symbolize that demonic power creeping underneath everything. The fedora completely ruined this and made him, putting unfortunate comparisons with internet incels aside, look a lot less sharp and refined. It looks awkwardly glued onto his head like a custom character in a cutscene. They didn't even bother to make the band the same blue as the interior of his coat, which would have saved it a little, I think. That said, I feel removing the fedora in Special Edition almost doubled down on this problem. It felt a bit cowardly, like the design team committed to that idea of the character because they thought it looked good. To take it away just feels like a silly compromise, but I guess I'm not going to complain about them actively trying to make it better. The original Vergil is obviously a lot better with how his colours communicate his story, but the simple contrasts with Vergil's coldness versus Dante's warmth here are perfectly serviceable. Yamato is a lot less fun. It loses its white handle and gold hilt in favour of a black and silver colour scheme, which does make sense considering the colour scheme of the character, but it loses the pop of personality old Yamato had. Abilities like his doppelganger, devil trigger, and summon swords just look so much worse. He does have some strange small touches that don't make much sense, like why does he have a zip titty pocket? That kind of breaks the sleek, angular sense of his design, but anyway. Talking about the character proper, he's fine, at least in the base game. His arc tracks well enough, and is naturally hinted to with his mentality around saving Cat. Definitely a villain that feels placed there more out of obligation than of anything else, and does sort of undercut Mundus in a lot of important ways, but he does have some genuinely interesting aspects, like, as I've mentioned before, how he's a kind of ends justify the means character, how his conflict with Dante is less personal and more based on a simple, fundamental difference in morals. I think my real problems with his character start around the Vergil's Downfall DLC, which try and slant it too hard into a personal tragedy, where I don't really feel that it works. I think this character could have had a much more interesting kind of complex introspective analysis to him that the game just doesn't go for, and that's a massive shame. B tier overall. Phineas is an interesting little character. He appears only during the Barbas section of the game very briefly, and guides Dante through limbo after Dante gets Phineas's mechanical eye back for him. He's most likely named for the Greek seer Phineas, who was blinded by the Harpies after blinding his own sons, which doesn't have much of a link with his character, but it is a cool inspiration. Thematically, he's meant to represent the game's balance between black and white, angel versus demon, and to help Dante grow a little and experience a little bit more of the moral grey. Immediately, it's a really striking design, this emaciated indigo-skinned demon with half of his head replaced by a mechanical device, which allows him to show the truth of things and cut through illusion. His design is filled with neat little pieces of duality, the mechanical versus fleshy sides of his head, a very open top to his robe but the rest of him is shrouded. This is really cool design work. A-tier design in general, just a really strong design for a side character with some interesting ideas to present to the game. Starting off the basic enemy designs, we have the Stygians. Stygians are the basic kind of like ground troops of Mundus's army. They come in 3 different varieties. They're a strong baseline for establishing the game's attitude to enemy design, and how it actually goes around classifying the world of the demons and showing us how these beasts exist. And it's actually pretty interesting. In this world, demons seem to take the form of broken facsimiles of humanity, with oily sludge leaking from this accrued mass of random bits of like scrap metal and abandoned possessions, which I think is a really cool and unique visual idea. It allows them to lean into a distinct visual style that keeps apart from the old kind of like gothic myths revisited kind of style of old DMC and break into something new, like kind of these steampunk grungy designs. And it actually does really good work with the whole, despite this apparent demonic facade of power, they're actually weak theme. Now, minor criticism before we go into actually talking about the Stygians. In general, across all of these designs, the steampunk angle is going to come across a lot more strongly in the concept art than in the actual game itself. And I think that's due to a general problem with visual clarity that will just kind of get worse and more egregious as we talk through these designs. Anyway, the Stygians work well for similar reasons to the marionette from Devil May Cry 1. They're this spooky creature that demonstrates how clearly weaker demons do cling to humanoid forms and human-made objects in order to manifest, but also twists the normal human form into weapons. I love how the Stygians handle it with like blades tucked into their arms that they flick out with like these mechanisms and then they leap and stab you. It feels like almost a little bit of a callback to the OG marionette without outright just doing that again. They also have this kind of cool progression. There are 3 forms of Stygians, and normally this would kind of resort to just like palette swaps, like this is Stygian 1 and he's red, this is Stygian 2 and he's green. But interestingly, these Stygians actually become more complete as they get stronger. There's less black sludge leaking out from their form. As well, their weapons become larger and more cruel with every evolution. I really like this idea. It's kind of like, as a demon gains demonic power, they become closer and closer to looking human, which is really interesting given how much the demons show disdain for humans and human technology, and yet they become exactly like them as they grow in power. The final elite Stygian becomes much more openly demonic as well, with its sludge solidifying into 2 giant horns. There's a good sense of continuation between these designs. You get this very strong sense of an evolution between lesser Stygian, regular Stygian, and the elite Stygian. I also like how each of these designs is represented as being blind. They're blinded by their own lust for power, and so cannot fight with clarity. The name of the Stygian refers to the river Styx from Greek mythology, the river that runs through the underworld, which could be implying that these are like lost souls who are becoming demons, which is quite a cool implication. Overall,
this is just a flat A tier design. There are no real complaints that I have that I could levy at it, other than, again, that just kind of lack of visual clarity within the game itself. I just don't think they stick strongly enough in my mind to be S, but they're a basic enemy, so they don't have to. Death Knights are the more elite soldier enemy type. They carry a lot of ideas over from the Stygians visually, and I think they're kind of intended to be the next step in the evolution chain after the elite Stygians. They also have folded arm blades, but they're much larger and much more obviously mechanical, and the sludge is almost entirely contained within their body. But again, this body is just kind of composed of scrap. This works fine for the Stygians because they're a basic enemy type. They don't need to have this kind of unique sense of form or purpose about them. But when you start getting to more elite enemies that are supposed to elicit a bit more of a, ooh, fuck, that guy's kind of tough out the player, I wish they'd do a little bit more. Lean in harder to the concept of demons picking up scrap and using it as weapons, and kind of make them more unique, other than just giving them a shield. For example, I think it would be a lot nicer if they were a bit bulkier. There's some bulky enemy designs in this game, but for the majority, most of them are kind of skinny and frail. And I think it would add a nice kind of variety in shape language if they played around a little bit more with the Death Knights to make them look a little bit more like knights. Maybe some kind of demonic mockery of the idea of a noble knight would be cool. Hell and Frost Knights are just kind of demonic and angelic palette swaps, respectively. They aren't really different in terms of form or function to a regular Death Knight, and the only real difference is their attacks, which for the Hell Knight is just kind of, they do a bit of a fire AoE, and for the Frost Knight they do a bit of an ice AoE. These don't really feel like hyper-demonic and angelic versions of an enemy, and I think it would be way cooler if they leaned in a lot harder to that. Instead of just kind of making them red or blue. Yeah, these designs are a real letdown, I find. Generally, the Death Knights are, again, pretty solid. I don't think they're as much of a just generally well-handled execution as the Stygians are, because they play a much different role, and I don't think they separate them enough from Stygians to do that. And again, I have a pretty major problem with how the Hell and Frost Knights are handled, but it's still a solid design overall. B tier. Ravagers are another solid design I feel gets done very dirty by how the presentation of the game kind of makes them all look like a random jumbled up mess of bits and pieces. Ravagers are supposed to be this kind of insane berserk, like Texas Chainsaw Massacre enemy that runs at you with a chainsaw revved in both arms and swings blindly. And yeah, even in concept art, they're kind of fine enough at being that. The way the concept art is drawn really draws attention to the angular, like, cold metallic edge of the design, and that's a quite interesting way to go with, like, a slasher type enemy, effectively. But there's nothing that really distinguishes it in terms of form from the other enemies. It's just another humanoid design with sludge leaking out of bits of him with an augmented blade arm. That's a chainsaw this time. It would be so much better if his tendency to recklessly run at you and swing were built into his design, inputting some, like, interesting elements of body horror and mutation that would positively build on the ideas introduced through the Stygian and continued through the Death Knight. Having his two arms be fused together, or these eerily long legs, or just something visually more interesting than just kind of like a metal guy that runs at you. As it is, the only reason these enemies are distinct is because of their sound design, which kinda sucks, as there are so many cool concepts you could execute on with this enemy with the design philosophy that the game has been going for. Even just making him more openly mechanical, like giving him exhaust ports in his back that shoot flames out of them when he rushes at you to give this kind of reckless, wild feeling, or double down even if you want to on like the cold steel exterior and mess with his shape language a little bit more. Maybe like I mentioned before, his arms are kind of fused together in this cold metal shell, and when you attack him, you break those apart and unseal him, and then there's this kind of fiery demonic form below. That'd be really cool. As it is, the Ravager is just a flat C tier. Harpies, meanwhile, are pretty neat. I like how they're used for this little cool piece of mythological framing that I mentioned with Phineas, as they are the Harpies that steal Phineas's eye in the story and also in mythology. These designs are also much better at communicating this idea of like a mockery of the human form, as the Harpies are obviously like these doll-like marionettes that have been overrun with the demonic sludge and have begun to like crack and break. However, despite this base concept being really fucking cool, again, I just wish the game got a bit more experimental, messing around with like the bodies of these creatures. Harpies, again, just kind of like attack you with an unfolding stabby arm blade, which is a little underwhelming. Like, I wish the wings were more mechanical and were built on a little bit more within the design, rather than just kind of being there and looking like shards of something, I don't know. I wish it was like this mechanical frame that had been mounted onto a marionette, or something like that. Just something to give a bit of extra zest to the design, instead of just kind of resorting to using abstract shape where it's not really necessary because they didn't really want to cook with what they had. However, that harsh piece of criticism given, I do love the small touches here. Like the mask looking like it comes from sort of pristine, innocent porcelain doll, contrasted with the brutality of the machinery on the Harpy's arm. That's just like really solid design work. I wish there was more of that built on with this design, so I'm gonna have to give it a B tier. Welcome back, Demonochorus from DMC 2, I didn't miss you. The Pathos and Bathos take on this cupid baby-like form, but possessed by demonic power. Again, we have another example of two kind of palette swap designs doing something very interesting. The less powerful Pathos is defined chiefly by the light burning within its chest and face, which it throws as a weapon. Much like the Stygians, its counterpart is also defined by being more closed off and complete, where the Pathos is kind of like this broken doll, the Bathos is perfect in form, but has the black sludge leaking out, and has this crossbow fused to one arm. Starting with Bathos, I think this is one of the few actually interesting plays we get on the corruption of angelic power within this world. The demons have obviously apparently won the war against the angels, and there are some enemies who've taken on angelic traits. That's a really interesting concept. It's too bad the game doesn't really play around with it in any meaningful way, apart from with designs like this, where this beacon of peace, almost, this light-giving cherub has been perverted into a weapon that burns all those that stand in its path. Pathos then continues this by being a really strong inversion of the typical image of a cupid. Typically, we imagine a cupid as like a little baby with a bow and arrow. This is a little demonic baby statue with a crossbow fused to its arm. The contrast here being that the mechanical crossbow is obviously a lot more of a cold and less natural weapon than the bow that Cupid is typically seen to use. And this is symbolic for the demons seeking the death of the natural, the death of compassion, and replacing it with cold, hard power. Also, the Bathos fires this crossbow while being blind, which gives this definite sense of like this disconnect from the rest of the world outside, pushing from the natural to the mechanical, while trusting in nothing but your own strength. I really like the use of naming here. Pathos is a Greek term used to describe emotion, more specifically something which has the ability to evoke a sense of compassion or pity out of someone else. A name which is applied to the much more outwardly angelic enemy. Meanwhile, Bathos, which means anticlimax or insincerity, is applied to the much more hellish enemy. A tier, actually. Generally, just very strong and competent designs. The Tyrant, again, returns to a very similar design language as the Stygians before it. This mechanical, dull-looking creature with demonic black sludge leaking out of it. It does have some interesting thematic elements within its design though. Its back, where most of the demon sludge leaks out, is its weakest point. Here we get some more building on the physical weakness of demons. It's also quite interesting that one of the most physically brutal, big, heavy demon types, with giant boulder fists, wears this kind of mask of almost playful innocence with like its baby Cupid face. And again, this is more building on demons hiding behind this kind of facade of angelic purity. But again, I struggle with the Tyrant a little, because I feel like its base concept could have been executed in a more interesting way. Like if you could knock the armor plates off to reveal the true demon within. Or if they built somehow generally on this more kind of running steampunk idea they've been going with. Again, it's not a bad design, and it does do some unique and interesting things, but I don't think it exactly excels either. It's very much just kind of a standard heavy enemy design. Butchers, meanwhile, are a pretty damn cool concept for a heavy enemy, and I wish they got played around with in the game a little bit more. Essentially, it's this little demon guy in this kind of steampunk mech with the buzzsaw blades, and a little window to look out at the world from. The window is the only part of the monster that you can actually attack, as Dante's attacks will just bounce off the rest. So once again, the weakest point of this kind of overwhelmingly strong, heavy enemy is the actual demon hiding inside it. Once again, demonic fragility, demonstrated excellently through gameplay. This guy can't even use his own strength. He's stuck inside this giant mech, and yet he's supposed to be one of Mundus's strongest demons. Generally, it's just a really cool design and a really fun idea. This is one of the designs that really sticks out to me from this game, and there's very little honest criticism I can give it. Very unique looking mech, very unique looking heavy enemy. I wish more designs in the game played around with their concepts like this one does. S tier. Rages are weird and kind of interesting. They're the only demon in the game that kind of goes for base DMC's animal chimerism angle, and they're sort of okay at that. They're like these blind cat-porcupine fusions that aggressively jump and scratch and bite at you. In the concept art, they're really cool. There's this strong color contrast between ghostly white and the blood red paws, and it's not like the most super detailed thing ever or the most thematically rich design you could ever think of, but it is just really simple and really cool, relying on a strong core color combination and really unsettling physiology to make a memorable enemy design. Unfortunately, because of the game's art direction, a lot of that gets lost. You don't really get the kind of cool contrast between blood red paws and ghostly white outline. All you really get is what looks like kind of a hairless rat. They're not really that imposing or interesting within the actual game itself. They come in 4 flavors. The basic version, the Spawn, which is basically just a hairless and toothless kind of baby version, the Ghost Rages, and the Blood Rages. Ghost and Blood Rages are just angelic and demonic variations on the regular Rage, and again, very similar to the Hell and Frost Knights, they don't do anything remotely interesting with that concept. These are not like angelically or demonically mutated versions of the regular Rage, which would be really cool because the Rage doesn't seem like a regular demon. Instead, they're just sort of like palette swaps, essentially. They don't have any cool abilities, all they can do is go invisible unless you use like an angelic or demonic weapon respectively. They're just fundamentally not interesting. However, I do really like the idea of including their spawn as a lesser horde enemy. It gives them this nice sense of continuity, much like with the Stygians, that allows Limbo to actually feel more like this living, breathing world. All of that said, Rages are a very mixed bag, and I would like to give them a higher score based on just how strong that original concept art is, but I can't. I really don't think the Ghost and Blood Rages are any good at all. The Rage spawns are just incredibly ugly in-game, like, beyond the point I can kind of forgive, and as I've already mentioned, while the concept art for the Rages is cool, the base Rages just don't look that good in-game either. I think this is a real case of the art direction just kind of slaughtering these designs, unfortunately. See here, witches feel like a potentially really interesting concept. Their base design isn't that interesting, as they are literally just a pale woman with snake nostrils, and they do feel very out of place with the rest of the demons on the roster, but it's at least interesting that one of the strongest demons chooses to take on this very obviously human form. What's really a shame is how their abilities and attacks manifest. In the concept art, they're shown with this really cool ability to kind of like shatter and reshape Limbo to their will, and I think that's a really cool concept that in-game isn't built on at all. Rather than forming their weapons, and specifically forming like these stabbing tendrils out of shards of the world, they just kind of throw flaming swords at you and make shields. This isn't very interesting. And as well, without those cool shard tendrils, the actual design itself is just very plain and uninteresting, despite the relatively clever thematic elements going on with it. This could have been an opportunity to explore something really interesting with the themes of this game too, like what if these are the souls of witches who were condemned in the witch hunts and they're now being puppeteered around by Mundus. This would link in really nicely with the running theme in this game of corruption of authority and abuses of power. As they are, they're fine. Solid C tier. Dream Runners and Drekivaks are the big two kind of mini-boss demons that Dante encounters in the base game. The Dream Runner is the more angelic variant with a white mask, and Drekivaks are the demonic variant with a red mask. Now, there is actually a bit more going on with these palette swaps, which makes for a nice change. They have armor in opposing places on the design, which gives an idea of these two being mirror images of each other. It's a simple trick that affords a strong contrast between the two. Even if nothing else in their designs really builds on that, you don't need it as much, because you've got that kind of small, interesting element. Their pale, gangly limbs, sparse armor, and unsettling masks do make them really striking, as well as the fact that they are visually set apart from all of the other demonic designs in the game. There's no black sludge controlling these creatures, there's no random bits of human technology welded together or giant mech protecting them. They're just like these odd humanoid creatures that wear these mocking masks, and the game uses that difference really well to create this unsettling aura about them that makes them feel fittingly like the final royal guards of Mundus. I love how these designs communicate this sense of demonic arrogance too, like these are the most powerful demons Mundus has to offer, and they refuse to wear any armor because they believe their power is so great they can just get around without it. I mean, hell, when you could portal around like that, you don't really need to. It also communicates this sense of deep-seated demonic vulnerability again. These creatures are literally naked, without armor, in an act which they think proves their power but also enhances their vulnerability. I think not using any of the steampunk elements here is actually a really good idea. It really communicates that these are a cut above the rest of the demons you've been fighting. They don't need any special human-made tools to fight you. All they need is their swords and a little bit of time. The Drekivak is actually named after this potentially really interesting demonic inspiration from Slavic folklore, the haunted ghost of unbaptized babies which wander the earth, killing and destroying until they finally find peace. And this has basically nothing to do with the Drekivak in the game, which I think could have been built in there somewhere, and would have been quite neat and interesting, I think. That said, that's not really a major criticism, and I think these enemies work really well. as effective elite demon designs, on the same level as the Frosts in DMC 1. However, the one thing I would say is that the Dream Runner feels like it lags behind a lot. It lacks a lot of the strong sense of menace that the Drekivak has behind it, with the strong color contrast between the red mask and the pale skin and armor not really being followed up in any way by the Dream Runner. It's not like it's an exact opposite, like with red armor, reddish skin, and a white mask, which would have been a lot cooler and a more interesting contrast to the Drekivak. Because of that, I go with a strong A tier from me. Critters are technically counted by the wiki to be an enemy type, even though you just kill them to get red orbs whenever they show up in a level, and they just kind of look like basic spiders in game. However, they do have a cool piece of concept art that shows them as this spider-fish hybrid with a human skull at the front, which is really, really nice. And I like the idea of just having neutral demons that don't really want to fuck with Dante, that just kind of exist in this world. The idea of a demonic ecosystem is very interesting to me, and that's another idea I wish this game would have followed up on somehow. B tier. These guys could have set an interesting precedent. Moving on to Vergil's downfall now, we have the Wisps. These are really fucking cool. They're demons bound in bandages with animal skulls for a head, that transform into this ghostly state to avoid damage. They're much more feral than the demons in the base game, attacking Vergil with their bone claws only. And it is again interesting, similar to the Dream Runners and Drekivaks, that they take on this human form. They feel strongly inspired by Native American myths, and legends of creatures like the Skinwalker and Wendigo, with the whole kind of animal skull head and the flock of ravens surrounding it. It's a cool enemy type, definitely, but unlike the Dream Runners, I don't feel like it cohesively ties in with the rest of the enemies in the game for me. It just kind of feels like they had a cool idea for an enemy and plopped it in without thinking how it would relate to the rest of the roster. That said, it's still a pretty cool design, so I'll give it a B tier. Imprisoners are the big boss elite enemy of Vergil's downfall, and they're just kind of okay. They're supposed to be the jailers of Vergil's own personal hell, the ones watching him and keeping him there. The strongest demonic enemies you can encounter in this campaign, and they're capable of using the world itself to attack you by setting up barriers and surrounding themselves with debris, which is interesting that they actually play around with actually imprisoning you rather than just being a regular beast. But outside of that, Imprisoners are just kind of the beta version of the Behemoth from DMC 5, where they're supposed to be this overwhelming, forceful beast design, and they just don't really work for me. They're okay with like the mouth split into 4 parts and the raw blood red skin, but they just don't stick out strongly in my mind. I wish they'd have built more on the idea of like an imprisoner, a jailer who's here to ensure Vergil doesn't escape his own personal hell, and as such had chains wrapped around them like the Behemoths in DMC 5, or just anything with a little bit more spice to it. Yeah, these designs just don't really strike me. I don't have that much to say about them. I think it's just a solid C tier from me. I think the Hunter Demon's pretty cool. He doesn't fit in super cohesively with what a lot of the rest of the game's designs do, but he does his own thing pretty well. He's supposed to be this demonic bounty hunter, essentially contractually bound to Mundus and forced to hunt Dante before he can become a real threat. He's got this gangly, unsettling set of proportions that remind me of like a wingless bat, and communicates how lithe and agile this character is. He prefers to dart around rather than facing Dante head on. You've got his weapons, like a spring-loaded bear trap, and this cool-looking, like, trench knife, which appears distinctly anachronistic with the rest of his beastly and feral image. I really like how you've got this kind of cage erupting out of his back. All of this comes together to form this really nice picture of basically a hunter/trapper. I wish this design was a lot more chimeric and kind of brought influences from other animals in, and generally just kind of went all in on making him look a little bit more fucked up. Like, I wish there was more kind of like random bits of metal and like hunting implements fused into him, and I think in like an ultimate perfect version of this design, I wish that would be implemented more into his attacks, but as it stands, the Hunter Demon's like pretty strongly solid. He's not really an antagonist that has that much kind of weight behind him in terms of like thematic relevance to the story, so him just having a kind of basic, imposing design works well enough. The Succubus is one of Mundus's big 3 lieutenants, and produces the secret ingredient that allows virility to be addictive, and allows Mundus to spread his control using the sedative effects of virility. Her design is pretty cool. It takes a lot more mythological inspiration from the root of the Succubus. Mythologically speaking, succubuses don't look like this. They look more like this. They're supposed to trick you with this kind of facade of being a beautiful woman, but in reality they're like a horrifying eldritch creature that devours all of your energy before killing you. Fitting in with that, this is a suitably hideous creature with this giant kind of amniotic sac on its back that reminds me of like a termite or ant queen, and this is something that I wish the design went actually a lot harder on, these kind of like insectoid elements to this design, like it's the queen of a hive. I think that would be a really cool motif with this kind of nectar that it's producing. You kind of get the sense that it's half going for that, but it is very half-baked. It's like the elements are sort of there, it's got like growths on the side of its head and multiple arms, but it's not quite full sending it to the next level. This is another example where I think taking more inspiration from the base Devil May Cry series use of like chimeric designs would be really fucking good. Generally speaking, I think this design has some really strong aspects to it. I really like how it's a succubus in the sense of virility is the front, and that's the thing that kind of drains your energy, and then you've got the succubus's real form hidden deep below the virility factory. That's just a really cool reframing of the mythological basis of a succubus. Again, I do just kind of wish it went harder on some of the aspects it's introducing. I think that would make this design both a lot more thematically interesting and a lot more visually interesting, rather than just kind of being this ugly blob creature. Again, a lot of issues with characterization here. I wish the characterization of this creature was worked out a lot more. As it is in-game, it's kind of just, "Bah! I want to kill you, Dante. I'm 500 years old, and I'm gonna kill you, and you can't kill me." And that just... it's just not a very interesting villain for Dante to go up against. I mean, granted, a lot of demons in the base Devil May Cry series aren't exactly winning any character contests, but they are a lot more interesting than just kind of like a Saturday morning cartoon villain. Hell, Succubus isn't even entertaining enough to be a Saturday morning cartoon villain. B tier. I think there is significant potential within the basis of this design, but it could be worked on a lot more. Here we go. He is the Bill O'Reilly parody himself. Bob is actually a fairly interesting design for multiple reasons. Number one, his name actually has some interesting mythological connotations. It's drawn from the demon Barbas. Barbas is said to appear as a lion's head that grants access to hidden or secret information. And I love how that's carried across, as Barbas is a demon of information in this game. A being which is initially made up of kind of random jumbled up bits of data that coalesces to form a literal talking head. A very subtle reference to how newscasters are often called talking heads. I think this whole, like, demon of information motif is just done generally really well with how the prison is like designed as a giant relay system with all of the information of the outside world being sucked up into Barbas's great big like Sauron broadcast tower at the center of it. I think that's just really creative use of the level to characterize this antagonist for us. And then there's the smaller things, like how he literally blasts you with beams of static, like he's just overloading you with so much information. And you fight him by breaking off his connection to all the sources of information he's been receiving. And that without that information, he kind of just becomes this blank face, devoid of personality. I think that's just such a set of really cool ideas that come together to make a genuinely memorable villain. My main critique is that I think this could have leaned a lot harder into the idea of Barbas controlling the populace a lot through hardware. Instead of showing our one Bill O'Reilly guy, have him control all of the world's major news outlets and flip between personalities as you fight him. Personalities that present the news about Dante in different ways. That'd be such a cool way to present the lack of true substance this character has, as well as his grip over the information and that the humans of this world receive. It would also tie into a lot of, like, the political themes that the game is going for. I think overall, though, he's just an excellent, really memorable design, and one of the standouts from this game for me, which you wouldn't expect given the really on-the-nose, look at him, he's Bill O'Reilly. As is, he's A tier. I genuinely think this is what they should have done with Mundus. Lilith is intended to be this very unkind satirization of celebrities who've had extensive plastic surgery. A demon who stretches human skin over themselves to appear more humanoid, and has this incredibly strange and uncanny appearance, like they're made out of plastic. I believe that she's supposed to represent this idea of fakeness, the idea that those maintaining control want to project this illusion of perfect grace and beauty, but come off looking more unnatural in the process. That's a really interesting idea, which genuinely does reinvent and build on the themes of the base DMC series, with the whole, like, demonic facade, hiding their true lack of power thing, being reinterpreted here with a more political and social angle. This is an interesting base idea, definitely, but since it draws from Western pop culture of the time, it's also kind of subject to the flaws of that Western pop culture. There's little else actually done with Lilith, not even revealing the true face hiding under the mask. So she's kind of just this empty, vain character that's never really built on, and as such, it does just end up feeling like a, look at celebrities who've had too much plastic surgery. They look ugly, don't they? Which, like, yeah, I guess, but what are you saying with that? So it kind of almost negates the interesting thematic elements it could have brought to the table. Functionally, she plays a role as the mother of Mundus's spawn, and the boss design when you fight her is this neat demonic perversion of, like, the mother and son dynamic. Lilith is desperately clinging on to her child, attached to it via an umbilical cord as you're attacked by this raging demonic fetus. Now, this is actually just straight up cooking. It may be kind of gross out for the sake of gross out, but it is a genuinely, really effectively horrifying design that ties together elements of Mundus with, like, the baby having 3 eyes and having one eye closed, like Mundus has one blind eye. Like, this is just a cool way of linking Mundus and Mundus's spawn together. And then you've got, like, the demonic corruption of a mother's love, with how Lilith is, like, sucked up into the baby, and is just, like, hanging there limp until you have to beat up the baby to get access to Lilith. I think that's just such, like, an effective, weird twist on the whole thing that shows perfectly the cowardice of Lilith and the difference between humans and demons, and how demons are fundamentally incapable of understanding something like a mother's love because they would rather put the baby out there to fight if it's powerful enough rather than try and protect it. Again, just a really effective use of body horror. There's something innately uncomfortable about this design, which just really gnaws away at you in a very effective way, and goes to strengthen the points that I was talking about earlier. Definitely an A-tier design. Really strong in all suits. I just wish a bit more was actually done with Lilith. Reboot Mundus is a very new take on the character, with a more explicitly human side. He's symbolically meant to represent the greed and arrogance of powerful people, both politically and financially, and how they abuse systems that claim to help in order to cause harm. His human form is pretty clever, actually. He's got 3 eye-shaped forehead dents that link back pretty nicely to his base design, and link back to original Mundus as well, as that was one of base Mundus's core motifs, the 3 eyes. As much as I previously teased it for playing close to previously well-known examples of fictional asshole billionaires like Lex Luthor and Jeff Bezos, it is just, generally pretty solid. There are loads of, little odd anachronisms that I wish were expanded upon, though. Like the fact that despite being this controlling facade of demonic power, his suit is actually very scruffy and, his buttons aren't done up, which is actually pretty interesting. It's a small detail, but when demons are working so hard to maintain this kind of image of absolute power and authority, it's interesting that their leader looks so scruffy, as it almost seems to hint to this sort of arrogance, like they don't even need to work that hard to project the illusion, or even the fact that, it's demonstrating this kind of deep-rooted weakness and misunderstanding of humans within Mundus. As well, you've got his seemingly blind left eye, just symbolizing his blindness to what's in front of him. There's loads of subtle bits of weakness injected into this design, and I just wish the characterization took that to the next level. This pretty solid human form is then almost completely and utterly fucked up by his full demon form. Even though, before I get into why I don't like it, it does have some cool concepts I need to talk about. It maintains a lot of the motifs of old Mundus. You've got this facade giant body protecting a weakened, corrupted demonic core. You've got his gradual loss of shape as Dante and Vergil keep fighting him, which mirrors how base Mundus loses his shape while Dante keeps fighting him in DmC 1. And this represents how, because he has little to no determination to keep his form and no real will beyond the demonic power, it's all just a facade and it crumbles really easily. I like the fact that the demon form also relates back to the enemy designs. Mundus has been swallowed entirely by the black goop that populates in Limbo, except the goop has had to possess man-made objects in which to, manifest in the human world and attack Dante and Vergil. And again, bringing back that constant sense of demonic weakness. They can't manifest properly without possessing something else. But then again, all of that said, I don't know if it's the waxy facial features or the ineffectual boss fight, but this design just feels so unintimidating and lackluster despite some of the good thematic building blocks here. I really struggle to find any strong feeling on it. Character-wise, I have a lot of problems with Mundus. His ideological conflict with Dante doesn't really work because the strong binary between humans and demons doesn't exist in this game. So when he decides to cruelly rule over all humans, there's kind of almost not a strong thematic counterbalance to him. In this world, humans are just kind of weak, stupid, and they don't know any better unless they're shown any better. There's no kind of counterbalance or better aspect to humans that's presented. There's no inner strength like there is in the base series. And I guess you can argue that, maybe the game is being more realistic, but that just ends with it being thematically quite unsatisfying. You just have then the angels acting as the objectively good saviors and the demons acting as the objectively bad guys. And yeah, the game does try to apply some kind of complexity to this, for example with Mundus's child, who Mundus does apparently seem to care about. But then that's never expanded upon. The game doesn't commit to any of these ideas. It doesn't commit to actually, like, showing the flaws of humanity. It just kind of makes them useless, passive observers in their own story, which really isn't thematically satisfying. And this is all exemplified so much in Dante's conversation with Mundus, where instead of, like, kind of rebuking him philosophically on any of his points, he just kind of goes, well, I killed your son, lol. And you can say, well, yeah, Mundus wasn't exactly going to change his mind, so what would be the point of waxing poetic here? The problem is more thematic and structural than it is to do with whether or not Dante could have convinced Mundus in this scene. It's the fact that, fundamentally, the story doesn't really have a strong message, and I'll get back to that in my conclusion. But anyway, Mundus is kind of a B-tier design to me. He's very fine. He's okay. His design is strong in some ways and weak in others, but I wouldn't really be able to find anything strong to say about this at the end of the day, unlike with base Mundus. Hollow Vergil is a DLC-only boss, and is Vergil's corrupted form that has manifested from his feelings of heartbreak and inadequacy after losing to Dante. And it's literally just him, but with negative colors. Okay. That's a pretty fine way to do a doppelganger. It's literally the reverse of the character that is a doppelganger of. It's alright. And then when he fuses with real Vergil, Vergil's big demonic form looks like this. I really hate this. Yeah, just generally, I don't like what they did with Vergil in the DLC. It feels like they took him from a very interesting place as a character, where he was doing the wrong thing for the right reasons, and he believed that the end justified the means, and that he believed that humans couldn't justly rule themselves without a greater being to look after them. All really interesting and genuinely fantastic ideas for a motivation for a villain in this universe. Someone who's taking over from a corrupt leader who just wants to use and abuse everything, to someone who genuinely wants to do right, but is going about that in the most arrogant and egotistical way possible, and looking down on those he wants to supposedly rule fairly. That's such an interesting concept. Yeah, it's been done before, I guess, but it's still something that you could build on so interestingly with the base themes of DMC and introducing the new political and social elements that this game has added. Do they do anything with that? No, they just kind of almost try and go the way of base series Vergil with making it more of a personal conflict between Dante and Vergil, but it just doesn't work. It just makes Vergil feel like, and I don't usually like saying this without cause, but it makes him feel very unnecessarily edgy and just kind of dark for the sake of being dark. I get some of these elements were introduced in the base game, but again, they weren't really built on in any way, and they're far less interesting than the other aspects that you could have played around with Vergil. Like, the idea of a character who was an ends justify the means type person, going through their own personal hell and being forced to reconcile with their mistakes, is so interesting, and they could have built on that in such an interesting way. But instead, they just kind of defaulted to, yeah, he's evil because he hates Dante, because Dante, big strong Chad, Vergil hacking virgin, Lamau. Yeah, this is just so uninteresting. D tier. To summarize, for me this is definitely a DMC 2 situation. There's lots of potential here, but nothing tying it all together. This feels like a very 2010s game, in the same way that, like, the Transformers movies feel very 2000s. You can't separate them from the era in which they came out, because they're so indelibly intertwined with the pop culture of that time, and you can like that or dislike that. But regardless, it feels just very dated in a way that the other games don't. But that's not really the biggest issue. The biggest issues are that from a structural level, all of the principal characters have gaping flaws in their characterization, which I don't really feel can be excused. And this is all down to a greater problem with committal. This game does not commit to a single plot thread it actually tries to go for. And I know a DMC defender is gonna say to me, well, they were building for a sequel. Yeah, but that doesn't mean the game itself can get away with not having fully formed ideas of its own that the sequel would then build on. As it stands, the game tries to go for so many things. Political and social ideas about abuses of power and how we need to rise up and rebel against those at the top. Kind of wasted, because those at the bottom don't get any characterization. Okay, a biblical discussion about the place of angels and demons and how there's actually more neutrality to them than meets the eye. Wasted, because the character of Phineas isn't built on, and so all this game does is kind of reinforce angels good, demons bad. Does it function as an exploration of mental health, as a coming-of-age story, finding oneself? No, because Dante doesn't find himself. He just sort of becomes the character he needs to be for the plot to continue without facing any of the struggles that he dealt with before. His alcoholism, his debauchery. It's never really brought up, or he's never really forced to face it. He undergoes no conflict as a character. His conflicts are always resolved super quickly, and when he's placed in a situation with the main antagonist, who he's supposed to have at least a passing thematic connection with, he just doesn't do anything. He doesn't respond. He doesn't reciprocate. Cast back. DMC 1. Mundus versus Dante. Mundus believes that humans can be used and abused as puppets. They do not matter because they do not have power. That's why he creates a puppet of Dante's mother to convince him to come to the island. He believes that nothing that is human or part human can ever be powerful, and that arrogance is what causes him to make a fatal mistake. Dante steps in front of him and reaffirms the fact that humans have strength of will and kindness, and that is something that Mundus will never understand, and that is why Mundus loses. DMC 2. Shit game. However, it at least managed to land some of its thematic elements of identity. Yeah, Lucia is a terribly written character in terms of dialogue, but her overall story of identity does come together. But if we want to go to DMC 3, oh boy, guess what? Themes of personal identity, themes of family, taking responsibility for family, themes of manipulating religion, ideas that the DMC reboot tries to go for, like abuse of power. So many disparate ideas and themes, all brought together beautifully within 4 characters. A story that is realistically like 2 to 3 hours long if we're talking about cutscenes, resolves so many disparate themes beautifully. And I could go on with DMC 4 and DMC 5, but I think you get the point. This game's problem isn't that its story is shit. Its problem is that it doesn't commit to the good elements of its story. It doesn't have the balls to kind of come out and actually make a statement about abuses of power. It just kind of uses the trappings of that. It goes halfway and then turns back around again and goes, I kind of don't feel like doing this anymore. Regardless, all that said, I would also be lying if I said this game didn't have some really strong sparks of potential. There is genuine craft to be admired here. This game isn't like a piece of shit like I've seen a lot of the fanbase make it out to be. It does have its own identity and its own interesting ideas to talk about. It just doesn't talk about them well. Anyway, that concludes it for this Yap session. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I hope you guys stick around to see the new videos that I am cooking up. I'll see you in the next one.